and welcome back to the Procurement and Finance Coffee Break. I'm Clair Green, your finance transformation expert, and I'm here with Richard Beaumont.
Richard, yeah, apparently I am still rated as a procurement guru. But there we go. Anyway, I'm really delighted today to welcome George Elkington, who is Chief Commercial Officer at NewOrbit. We'll hear about that in a minute. But actually talking about something which, you know, many people have heard of, but maybe not many people fully understand, which is technology implementation. You know, the methodologies that can do that. You may have heard the word Agile. Some of you will be familiar with the word Waterfall. And of course, there's a hybrid. And I hope today we're going to discover it. But George, perhaps you'd like to just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you got to NewOrbit and what NewOrbit does. Oh, you've gone mute, George. You're on mute. No, it's still muting you. There we go.
I'm not muted now. Yeah, that's added authenticity. So, yeah. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. Firstly, thank you for inviting me. I grew up with big IT firms, so Accenture and Deloitte for 20 years. Then I kind of saw the light and did more entrepreneurial things, did a software business with 3 friends, sold it. And then I've been working with scale-ups and startups for the last 10, 15, 20 years, something like that.
Wonderful. Well, I'm delighted you're here. And actually, I know we're going to talk about software, but I might just sneak in a question a bit more broadly about Agile in a minute and see what you think. But yeah, off we go.
Before we dive into the questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about what NewOrbit does and its approach to delivering web-based solutions, and just about your experience in growth and digital transformation?
Yeah, sure. So NewOrbit was founded by 2 friends. I've known them kind of 20 years, and they founded the business about 15 years ago. They're both ex-Microsoft. And they saw a gap in the market to take a business idea all the way through design, development, and support, and a continuing enhancement of the solution going forwards. And they proved to be right. So the business is growing profitably and always has been for the last 15 years. We build custom solutions for our clients that tend to be mission critical applications. So these are not back office ERP, they're not desktop automation. These, to a large extent, either are the business or are a significant line of revenue, line of business for the organization. So they're really critical digital products. Our clients, we start with large PLCs, consumer credit reference agencies. Then we've got several of the sort of larger accounting firms. We've got BDO, RSM, Forvis Mazars, and then we work with scale-ups and startups that you wouldn't have heard of, but you know, typically 1 to 500 employees, something like that.
Yeah. Wow.
Okay, that's interesting. So on this, so obviously you got a years of experience in digital transformation, but one of the questions is how do you execute, and how do you adapt your execution methodology to suit what it is you're actually doing? For example, my background is a lot of global ERP implementation, so we're implementing finance, could be supply chain, inventory, procurement in multiple countries. And often getting rid of a number of legacy systems in the process, so a large green scale implementation. My preference to do that is the waterfall approach, where you understand the totality of your requirements up front. But there is the agile approach, where you approach it kind of a little bit more piecemeal. So, George, to start off with,
can you tell you're talking to someone from finance in that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I've got a few stereotypes I might use, both for finance and for procurement. So we'll come back to
Everything in
that.
a waterfall, step by step.
Yeah. Yeah.
How much is this going to cost, and what do I get for my money? Those are the two stereotypical questions. I share your experience, Claire. So I grew up with Accenture and Deloitte, and from 91 onwards through till about 2006, I was working in the ERP space, predominantly SAP, but I did also touch on Oracle. And you're absolutely right. In that space, it makes much more sense to go down the waterfall route, because you can't implement an ERP system and say, oh, really sorry, this works, but we haven't done the VAT bit yet. That bit got cut in the last scrum, or the last cycle. We had to drop that. It wasn't quite working, but we're going to go live without it. It kind of that concept goes away. And of course, I grew up with Waterfall, but I become a convert to Agile. The flip side of the Waterfall approach is that the first ERP implementation I worked on took 3 years. I was only involved in the last year of it, but it took 3 years from initial design through to go live. And by the way, that was considered by
I'd say quick.
That was considered a success by the energy company that went live in January 1993. Right. And it was international as well. It was 2 countries, England and Scotland. It's very important. Whenever I speak to Scottish friends, they love me when I mention that. So if anyone listens in from Scotland, it was a binational implementation. The issue with that is that over the 3 years, we live in a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And Murphy's Law, in 3 years, quite a lot of things will have changed. So if you're really lucky, you end up in 3 years' time exactly where you plan to be. There probably will have been a few changes along the way. Yeah. But the amount, your flexibility to change it, you've already designed something and you've built it and now you're testing it. At that point, to change it and go back to design, you might add another year to your 3-year program. Really tricky. So the risk with that approach is you end up where you initially wanted to be, but no longer where you want to be now because the world has changed. Mm-hmm. The Agile approach is different. If I was going to be a bit cynical, you don't know where you're going to end up at the end, because at each stage you're working on the part of the scope that you believe will add the most value to your customers, either internal or external, and you keep working incrementally towards it. So the good news is you will end up adding value to your stakeholders, your customers. The bad news is you might have a red solution instead of the blue one that you intended to have, but red is what works in the marketplace.
I've got a cheeky question that I'm adding in here, though.
That wasn't part of the brief.
That question over so imagine you're doing the scale of a large ERP implementation, but you've decided to adopt an Agile approach. So how do you, when you start off, ensure that the roadmap that you present in terms of what you're going to deliver as a DevOps team in each quarter is accurate? Because this is where I don't like the Agile approach for big greenfield implementations, is that my experience is that the estimating the amount of work based on the requirements in the roadmap is often underestimated, and then stakeholders are promised delivery of a solution in Q4 or something, and it ends up being Q4 2 years down the road. So how do you get round that if you're putting together a DevOps roadmap, but you haven't actually got into the requirements in that much detail to size them?
Well, of course, it's really hard. I think there's a Scandinavian proverb which is forecasting is difficult, especially about the future. So you're really kind of highlighting that example that if you haven't firmed down your requirements, it's going to be really hard to have absolutely crystal clear estimates and budgets, and therefore as a result, you might put a stake in the ground and say this is something for Q4, and then it ends up being, Q5, which of course there are only 4 quarters in a year. So how does that work? Well, tricky. I think what we're touching on here is the melding of the traditional waterfall approach, which is kind of how we've done big projects. If you're building a bridge, Brunel used waterfall. You can't sort of build half a bridge and then kind of go, I've decided to make this. Suspension bridges don't work. We're going to change approach. It's going to be compression. No, I'm an engineer as well, Richard. So, you got to start by saying this is a suspension bridge. You got to see it all the way through on that principle. So what does begin to work with a Agile approach, melding waterfall with Agile, is to say, let's do something up front that maps out roughly what we think is going to work. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So I did work with, in my Accenture days, with BP. And we implemented, that was my one Oracle project. Right. We implemented it in a semi-agile way. So instead of doing the 3-year program that Conoco did with SAP, we did a 3-year program broken into quarters. And we say this functionality is going to go into that quarter, and we have cycles to keep it iterative and keep it real. That was rolled out across Europe. I think it was 17 countries, 3 business units. So it became 51 individual sort of P&Ls. And again, that was a success. But we did have the example that you gave where something was maybe not 2 years late, but could easily have been 1 or 2 quarters late. And I think what that organization was able to do is to set the expectations that, finance, we can constrain this by the budget. We'll spend exactly what you tell us we can spend. But you may get more or less than for the money than we originally expected, because we're working with this hybrid agile approach. Similarly with procurement, you can't say exactly what you're going to get at the end of the day for your money.
No, I'm going to throw away the next 2 questions because actually, look, we've kind of touched on it, but actually, I want to ask the 2 of them in a different way, right? Which is, the way that I've always viewed the difference, the binary decision between doing Agile or doing Waterfall is that you are trading certainty for either faster development or for innovation within that development. And that's a risk-based decision about what you're going to do. And, if you took my working style and Claire's working style, it is that different. If you go with me, you're going to get Agile, because I will make it up as I go along, but I will maintain a viewpoint of what we're trying to achieve. But if there's an opportunity to do something differently or better, I will take it. Claire, by nature, and not a criticism, it's just a different approach to work, is by nature a waterfall person. It's there is a structured, understandable crossing of the T's and dotting of the I's. And what I've observed is the hardest part of the decision, not, as you said, in a greenfield, the decision about whether Agile or Waterfall is the right one, it actually is less important than the engagement of the stakeholders to reassure them that one or other can work. Because I know if I walked into a room and sat down with Claire and said, right, I'm going to go Agile, this is what I think I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you that in some quarters we're going to underspend, in some we're going to overspend, in some quarters everything we spend will be wasted because we'll have explored an opportunity and discovered that it didn't work. Are you okay with that? I know the reaction that I'll get. So what I'd love to do is, rather than sort of talking about cost predictability and resource and choosing the right methodology, can I just ask you, how do you approach this issue of, the boards of companies, of getting them comfortable, irrespective of where their comfort naturally sits, with either an Agile or a Agile approach? Because that, to me, is the really hard bit.
Yeah, let me give you an example where, actually, in a funny kind of way, applying a bit of both,
right,
is the right answer. It's not always the right answer, but it can be. So the value of the waterfall approach is you can say, right, we've got this thing, it's going to cost X.
Yeah.
You know, can you afford X? We estimate the value, you know, the benefits will be Y. Is Y higher than X enough? Or maybe there are no benefits, but you got to do it because the government says the VAT rules are changing or something. Then you just got to do it. And we just try and comply in a sort of cost-effective and reliable manner. So that would be a classic waterfall example. So I'll give you an example from our real life. An employee came to us with a referral to a friend of his in the corporate world, and they had an idea for a new digital product. Can't tell you what it is because it's we're under NDA, but they said, how much would this thing be? And we said, well, okay, that's not really how we work, because we would build this as a new product. We would do this in an agile approach. And they kind of said, yeah, but we need to know, because we need to go to the board and get approval for spending whatever it is, you know. So we said, okay, well, we're not going to do it like this, but if we were going to do it in a waterfall approach, it would cost this. And it was, we gave a range, £300,000 to £400,000.
Yeah.
Okay? So the organisation went off, got approval. They're not actually quite told us what the number was, but they probably had some of their own costs added onto that. So, you know, let's say they got approval for £1 million. And then we said, now, do not spend all your money in one go, because you might do that and find that it doesn't quite work. Nobody is willing to pay for what we've built. Let's do it like this. You're what they called a minimum viable product. Which is a whole nother thing. Generally, people come to us with a minimum viable product that is actually too big. Okay. So we spend a lot of time working them down, and I would say the average MVP actually has 10 elements within it, each of which would be I've come up with a new acronym, you know, a small non-viable product element or something like that. It's almost like a sub idea. And you'd say, well, if people were going to pay for this thing, you know, you know, predicating on that, they need to be willing to pay for this, wouldn't they? And you know, generally speaking, you'd be able to have a conversation about what that would be, depending on what the idea was. And so the customer, when we played that back, they said, "Oh yeah, we've done surveys. People are willing. You know, we've asked 200 people, and they all say they're willing to pay for this." I said, "Well, what people say in a survey is very different from what they'll do in real life. So let's just test it out. So for £5,000." we could test the first element of their idea and then prove, okay, they are willing to pay for this. And then you go on from there. And then you take the next idea that might be 10,000, 20. And what we find is, even if you're good, about 80% of your ideas don't pass the market test. Really harsh reality. But that's in a space where you're being creative and you're inventing a new product. That's not ERP world. That's not VAT regulation, financial services regulation, I don't know, food safety or something like that. But it might be around, I don't know, I mentioned food safety. So supposing you run a coffee shop, it's not a highly regulated industry, but there are some rules. You've got to label your products to say this has nuts in it, that has gluten in it, this has dairy in it, ... You could build an app that was nothing to do with the regulated part of the business, but was to do with, I don't know, rewarding frequent drinkers at your establishment and saying, George, you've had 10 cups of coffee, the next one's on us or something. That would be non-regulated, and you could do that in a very agile approach. Whereas if you're doing something in food safety or whatever, you probably have to be more waterfall.
So I know. Hang on, I know she's going to ask the last question, but I'm just going to sneak a little one in, and it's only it's probably a one-line answer. If you're left your own devices, I suspect you could look at a project and you could make a decision as to whether it suits Agile or Waterfall or Agile. But then, as you've just said, you've got your client or leadership team of a business that's got its own views. Which would you say is the harder thing to do? Deciding the right approach from a technical point of view, or deciding the right approach that you can convince the customer, the board, to do?
Almost always, we're working with organisations that are comfortable with Waterfall, but need to move to be more agile.
Right.
And so the interaction tends to be around moving them in that direction and probably reminding them about, the last time they implemented an ERP or an MRP, and they kind of go, yeah, well, we paid, 50 million quid or some enormous number. And at the end of it, we had to spend an extra 10 million and we didn't even get what we wanted. And you kind of go, well, why was that? And you sort of explore it through. And then they kind of go, something where each time we're only risking 5k or 50k instead of it being in the millions. And we're staying close to the market. And when things change, we can be adaptable. That is attractive. Of course, finance are always going to ask, and how much is this going to cost? And procurement are always going to ask, and what do I get for my money?
It's usually because there's some board approval and a procurement process to go through to actually go ahead with it, right? But you're right. I think one of the issues I've seen a lot in large scale kind of waterfall greenfield ERP implementations is an understanding of the business requirements, because often you're moving from legacy systems that are fairly standardized, but there's quite a large element of unautomated processes, and what you're trying to do is lift and shift those processes in a optimized way into your new ERP, plus that, let's say 20%, 30% of manual activity you're wanting to automate as much as possible in the new ERP. Let's say you're moving to SAP. And one of the problems is in an ERP situation is that when they say, oh, we didn't get what we thought we were going to get, is because the requirements weren't understood correct in the first place, or they just focused on happy path. They go, oh, they did some sandboxing, they focused on happy path, they go, oh yes, that looks like it does what we thought it would do, but then when it comes to end user testing, all these extra requirements come off. We go, oh, we've got all these hundreds of unhappy path situations. We just forgot about them. And then they go, oh, can you not do something about these? Did you not psychically know we had these requirements? Well, no. So anyway, I think there is very much a case for, at the start where you're trying to, build a business case, have a waterfall approach, but then moving to a more agile approach where you're getting the business to actually test what you're building, so that you don't get into that situation, right, where you're at the end, you've got a bunch of new requirements that everyone forgot about. They expect you to know about them through some sort of osmosis.
Well, you're touching on a whole bunch of things there, Claire, because I remember in my ERP days that we would do a design, call it what you will, blueprint or something, and then we'd expect the business to read it and sign it off, which that was the term we generally used. Actually, over time, I came to hate. Because it became meaningless. We're asking people to sign stuff off so we could start building based on what was written down. And in reality, it was meaningless because probably we've written hundreds of pages and not one person had read every page. We could have put, I was tempted at times to put, a copy of the B note from 1972, in section 17B, and see whether anyone noticed, because and then a year later when you built it, you're sort of, we were surprised when people said, oh, this isn't really what I wanted or needed or something, and you kind of go, well, if you read what we wrote down, this is what you've got, what we wrote down, but not necessarily what you actually wanted or needed. The agile approach, it's not magic, but it does help a bit with that, because you're putting the product, the solution in front of your audience and saying, we've tried to understand what you wanted, Claire. It looks like this. And then you can kind of go, oh, why have I got yellow triangles in the top left-hand corner? Why, I wasn't expecting that, ...
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what? I know we're very short of time now. But interestingly, one of a big topic, particularly in my world in procurement, is where there's always been a lot of solutions out for different stages of the procurement process, whether you're looking at spend management or risk management or whatever. And that is accelerating. There are so many technology startups powered through AI now in every dimension. It's actually kind of impossible for companies to go through what was a traditional process to go and select technology that might help them, let alone adjust it. And what I've observed is that many people are talking about adopting the same approach you do when you're trying an app on your phone. We're going to give it a go, and if we like it, we'll stick with it, and if we don't like it, we'll go and use a different one. And the biggest resistance, and this comes back to my earlier question, is trying to get the culture in the organization that says, I'm going to give you some money so that you can do a 2-month trial of 3 different bits of technology, 2 of which, or maybe all 3 of which, you might reject at the end of that period. But yeah, have the money, go and try it. That's not a very common situation, and yet it is what companies genuinely need to do, because instead of building big end-to-end ERP solutions, or in my world, the big single Ariba kind of end-to-end procurement solutions, people are building ecosystems, and they're orchestrating ecosystems of tools, and using one of the many automation tools to orchestrate paths for different outcomes through different technology sets. In that context of agile as an approach to just business in general, not just developing software, I mean, what's your view on how, it's always coming to, if you had one piece of advice, what would it be? If you're faced with, I need to do these things, and I need to make the business case where I can adopt an agile approach with the risk, but with the potential upside, what would be your key takeaway for someone who needs to make that business case?
Okay, I would say test and learn. And I'll give you another example, nothing to do with building IT. Imagine a private equity owned business,
right?
And the board sitting around the table, and the private equity partner coming in and saying, I think our margins are too low. Why don't we put our prices up? And the board going, sucking on their teeth and kind of going, oh, no, we couldn't do that. We might upset our customers. They might flip and leave and join the competition. And the private equity owner saying, when did you last test this?
Right.
Silence. So they all had if you like, a prejudiced view. They couldn't possibly put their prices up. And if they did, they would lose market share. And the private equity person was kind of saying, our margins are, let's say, 10%. Why don't we put our prices up so our margins become 20%? If we lose half our customers,
we're in the same place.
We're still in the same place, but we've got less work, and we've freed up some other resources to go and do some other stuff, right. and at least we know. Can we try that? Can we just try that on the blue products? Our cash cows, the red stuff, leave that where it is. Learn from the blue. That's only 20% of what we do. If it works, do it with the red ones as well.
Right.
Whatever. So I'll come back to test and learn.
I think
it is, and I think we're too afraid. I think it's probably a little bit of a British cultural thing, but I think it's a Western world thing. We're sort of too afraid to try stuff. We're too afraid of failure. We don't celebrate the success when we get it from learning something.
But maybe that also needs to be reflected in commercial models as well. Because going back to your example, Richard, of the app, right? We're all used to downloading an app and having a week's free trial of it before we commit to buying it, right?
Yeah.
But there's loads of solutions in the fintech sector, for example, where that same approach could be provided. Giving access to customers of I don't know, maybe some MVP or kind of slimmed down version of the product.
Yeah.
Where customers can just play with it for a month or 2 months before they commit to buying it.
I think there's a lot that could be done on both sides, and and as you say, the only way you can test and learn is if you can get your hands on something in a way that's economically viable for you to be able to go and try it. I mean, of course there's a risk, but that's the fun of trying things in a different way. George, honestly, thank you for sharing insights, and as ever, thank you for being very willing to go off-piste with us as well. What for those that are watching and listening, what you won't have heard is we spent the half hour we were supposed to be preparing talking about completely different topics and having a very nice conversation as well. So I'm delighted, I'm delighted. So look, from my perspective, George, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye from us. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.